Hello YouTube, this is DK02 here, and I'm going to be doing what's going to actually be a two-part video because it's 3 hours long, an hour and a half for each cassette. Goes Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. I brought this off of the Cinema Sickness. William Conrad is the narrator. This will end up being hopefully two-part. Well, like this one will be one whole part, and the other one will be I'll be separating it into 2 videos. Enjoy.
Dove Books on Tape presents Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, a novelization by Rob McGregor, based on the film directed by Steven Spielberg, story by George Lucas and Menno Mays, screenplay by Jeffrey Boehm. The warm spring afternoon had drawn students outside in droves. A black raven soared silently above the students and landed on a window ledge on the second floor of one of the ivy-covered buildings. Inside, a professor, wearing a tweed jacket and wire-rimmed glasses, glanced toward the window. There was an underlying ruggedness about him, a sense that when he took off his coat and tie and ventured out into the field in search of ancient artifacts, anything could happen, and probably did. Those who knew him well were aware that he tended to understate his own experiences. Maybe it was because he felt he lived in the shadow of his famous father, the renowned medieval scholar, Dr. Henry Jones. He looked out over his class, hands jammed in the pockets of his pants. So, forget any ideas about lost cities, exotic travel, and digging up the world.
This was the guy that's narrating this is the one that played on
research and reading. That's
that
the key.
one
we
show
mythology at face value, nor do we follow maps,
which was Jake and the Fat Man.
And never does X mark the spot. The lost continent of Atlantis, Knights of the Round Table, nothing more than charming romantic nonsense.
Yeah, he was the
class laughed. He cleared his throat.
As the thing says, the one guy
with the excavation of Naucratis by Flinders Petrie in 1885. As the students filed out, Indy shouldered his way to his secretary's desk. The
He
woman
sounds like that one that plays Ichabod's son.
looked as if she was suffering from shell shock. She saw Indy and
I don't
suddenly
think
reacted.
so, because like I said,
For heaven's
This guy, his name is William Conrad.
This is your appointment schedule, and these
He,
papers still haven't been.
like I said, that's why I said about. It has on the back here. He played the guy in Jake and the Fat Man.
Wait, Dr. Jones, my great. Sign my registration card, will you please? Listen, Dr. Jones, if I could just have Indy held up his hand. And suddenly the mob was silent and attentive. Irene, put everyone's name down on a list in the order they arrived. I'll see each and every one of them in turn. Irene glanced from Indy to the students. The horde immediately descended on her like a swarm of mosquitoes. Well, we'll try, she muttered. Indy slipped into his office and impatiently sorted through his mail. An assortment of college bulletins, archaeological newsletters, the current issues of Esquire and Collier's, and a thick envelope with a foreign postmark on it. He stared at it a moment. Venice. He tried to think of whom he knew in Venice and came up with a blank. Before he had a chance to open the envelope, Marine's distraught voice squawked over the intercom. Dr. Jones, there seems to be some disagreement out here about who arrived first, and Fine, Indy cut in. Do the best you can. I'll be ready in a moment. Like hell I will. Indy stuffed his mail into his coat pockets, took a quick look around, and then opened his window and crawled through it. He took a deep breath of late afternoon spring air as he stepped out into the adjoining garden. Roses, gardenias, grass. Oh, it was marvelous. As he reached the curb outside the building on the edge of the campus, a long black Packard sedan pulled up to him. Indy glanced inside and was about to continue on his way when the back door swung open and a man stepped out. He was dressed in a dark three-piece suit. There was a no-nonsense look about him. Everything he saw told Indy that he was a G-man. Dr. Jones? Indy met his gaze. Yes, is there something I can help you with? We have something rather important to talk to you about, sir. We'd like you to come with us. Indy hesitated, looking the man over closely, a bulge in his coat. Oh, terrific, I need this. For the next half hour, Indy was ensconced in the back seat of the Packard between two of his burly escorts. They ushered him into a plush Art Deco penthouse and disappeared, leaving him in a room furnished with numerous museum-quality artifacts on display. Indy's inspection was interrupted when a door opened in front of him. The doorway was filled by a tall, broad-shouldered man in a tuxedo. His jaw was square, his blonde hair thinning. Even though he appeared to be well into his 50s, his physique was trim and muscular like that of a much younger man. There was something regal about him as he strode across the room, and Indy had no doubt that he was about to meet the owner of the penthouse. He looked familiar, but why? And then he knew. He was one of the major contributors to the Archaeology Museum. He'd seen him a couple of times at social events associated with the museum. His name was Walter Donovan, that was it. I trust your trip down was comfortable, Dr. Jones, Donovan smiled, exuding confidence and power. My assistance didn't alarm you, I hope. I know who you are, Mr. Donovan, Indy said as Donovan released the firm grip on his hand. Your contributions to the Archaeology Museum have been extremely generous. Well, thank you. Some of the pieces in your collection here are very impressive, Indy added, looking around. Now, what the hell do you want with me? Oh, I'm glad you noticed. Donovan walked over to a table where an object was covered by a cloth shroud. It was one of the pieces Indy had not examined. Donovan pulled back the cloth, revealing a flat stone tablet about 2 feet square. I'd like you to take a look at this one in particular, Dr. Jones. Indy moved closer and saw letters and symbols inscribed on the tablet. He removed his wire-framed glasses from his pocket, slipped them on, and leaned over for a closer examination of the ancient artifact. Can you translate the inscription, Dr. Jones? Indy frowned as he stared at the inscription. Finally, he cleared his throat and spoke in a slow, halting voice, like a child who was just learning to read. Drinks the water that I shall give him, says the Lord, will have a spring inside him, welling up for eternal life. Let them bring me to your holy mountain, in the place where you dwell, across the desert and through the mountain to the canyon of the crescent moon, broad enough only for one man, to the temple of the sun, holy enough for all men. Indy stopped, looked up at Donovan with a startled expression, saw no reaction on the other man's face, and continued with the final line. For the cup that holds the blood of Jesus Christ our Lord resides forever. The Holy Grail, Dr. Jones. Donovan's voice was hushed, reverent. He was obviously impressed by what Indy had read. The chalice used by Christ during the Last Supper, the cup that caught his blood at the crucifixion and was entrusted to Joseph of Arimathea, a cup of great power to the one who finds it. Indy rubbed his chin and looked dubiously at Donovan. I've heard that bedtime story before. Eternal life, Dr. Jones. He emphasized the words as if Indy hadn't heard him. The gift of youth to whoever drinks from the Grail. Donovan, it seemed, was taking the inscription at face value rather than considering it in a mythological context. Now that's a bedtime story I'd like to wake up to, Donovan continued. An old man's dream. Every man's dream, Donovan countered. Including your father's, I believe. Indy stiffened slightly at the mention of his father. Grail lore is his hobby. He spoke evenly, covering the discomfort he always felt when the Grail and his father were mentioned in tandem, like parts of a rhyme or a riddle. More than simply a hobby, Donovan persisted. He's occupied the chair of medieval literature at Princeton for nearly 2 decades. He's a professor of medieval literature, the one students hope they don't get. Indy was fascinated by the Grail tablet. He wouldn't swear to it, but he was almost certain the tablet was what it appeared to be. The fact that it existed was an important discovery. What it could lead to was something he didn't even want to consider right now. Hard to resist, isn't it? Donovan commented, acutely aware of Indy's interest. The Holy Grail's final resting place described in detail. That's simply astounding. Indy shrugged and recovered his skeptical, scientific attitude, the one that dominated his classroom persona. What good is it? The tablet speaks of deserts and mountains and canyons. There are lots of deserts in the world. The Sahara, the Arabia, the Kalahari, and the mountain ranges, the Urals, Alps, Atlas. Where do you start looking? After the Grail was entrusted to Joseph of Arimathea, it was lost for 1,000 years before being found again by 3 knights of the First Crusade. 3 brothers, to be exact. No, I've heard this one too, Indy interrupted and finished the story himself. 150 years later, after finding the Grail, 2 of these brothers walked out of the desert and began their long journey home. But only one made it back, and before dying of extreme age, he imparted his tale to a Franciscan friar. Donovan nodded. Now let me show you something. He walked across the room and returned with an ancient leather-bound volume. He opened it carefully. It was obvious that the pages were extremely brittle. This is the manuscript of the friar. He paused a moment, letting that fact fully register. It doesn't reveal the location of the Grail, but the knight promised that 2 markers had been left behind that would lead the way. Donovan pointed at the stone tablet. This, Dr. Jones, is one of those markers. This tablet proves the story is true, but as you pointed out, it's incomplete. Seconds pass. Indy could almost feel them filling the room and felt his own body tense, waiting for Donovan to continue. The second marker is entombed with the remains of the knight's brother. Our project leader, who has brought years of study to this search, believes that tomb is located within the city of Venice, Italy. What about the third brother, the one who was left behind in the desert? Does the friar say anything about him in his manuscript? The third brother stayed behind to become the keeper of the Grail. As you can see now, Dr. Jones, we are about to complete a great quest that began almost 2,000 years ago. We're only one step away from actually finding the Grail. Indy smiled, and that's usually when the ground disappears from under your feet. You may be more right than you know. How so? We've hit a snag. Our project leader has vanished, so has his research. We received a cable from Dr. Schneider, his colleague. Schneider has no idea of his whereabouts or what's become of him. I want you to pick up the trail where he left off, find the man, and you will find the Grail. Can you think of any greater challenge?
Liz, your computer
Indy
still
gave a
playing?
small, uncertain laugh. Challenge was
Yep.
for one thing, stupidity was quite another. Besides, he rationalized, he had a commitment to the university to fulfill. He couldn't just run off, especially since he had just returned late from another little field trip. You got the wrong Jones, Mr. Donovan. Why don't you try my father? I'm sure he'd be fascinated by the tablet and ready to help out in any way. We already have. Your father is the man who's disappeared. Indy sped along a tree-lined boulevard through an old neighborhood. A block later, Indy pulled over, screeching to a halt at the curb. He glanced for a moment through the windshield toward the house, partially hidden by a hedge and some trees. He hopped out of the Ford and was halfway to the front door when Marcus Brody, director of a prestigious archaeological museum and longtime friend of his father's, caught up with him. Your father and I have been friends since time began. I've watched you grow up, Indy, and I've watched the two of you grow apart. He climbed the stairs to the porch a step behind Indy. I've never seen you this concerned about him before. Indy strode across the porch. He's an academic, a bookworm, not a field man, Marcus. Of course I'm concerned about... The front door was ajar, and it silenced him. He and Brody glanced at each other, and Indy stepped cautiously closer, muscles tight, expectant. He touched his hand to the door and nudged it open. It creaked. The air that struck his face was cool, empty. Dad? Henry? Brody, his father's old friend, called out as he followed Indy inside. Their voices echoed hollowly. Indy's dread bit more deeply. He grimaced, and Brody whispered, Dear God. The room hadn't just been ransacked, it had been decimated. Drawers had been pulled out and dumped on the floor. Shelves had been swept clean. The couch cushions had been torn away and hurled across the room. Books, letters, and envelopes were strewn through the mess. Brody's face skewed with concern and worry. What's that old fool gotten himself into anyway? I don't know. But whatever it is, he's in over his head. I just can't imagine Henry getting involved with people he couldn't trust. Look, they've even gone through his mail. And he stared at the clutter of torn papers and envelopes and suddenly realized he had forgotten about his own mail. The mail. That's it, Marcus. He immediately rifled through his pockets and pulled out the overstuffed envelope that he'd been carrying around since he left his office. He looked at his foreign postmark again and shook his head. Venice, Italy. How could I be so stupid? Brody looked baffled. What are you talking about, Indy? He tore open the envelope and pulled out a small notebook. He quickly flipped through several pages. It looked like a journal or diary. Page after page was covered with handwritten notes and drawings. Brody glanced over Indy's shoulder at it. Is it from Henry? That's right. It's Dad's Grail diary. But why did he send it to you? He lightly stroked the leather cover of the diary. He trusted me. He finally did something to show that he trusted and believed in me.
Oh, he got his thing
Can
out.
I see it?
Listening to the. You gotta wait, Clint,
Brody
because
paged through the diary.
they're doing that testing on the med ed today,
Yeah.
and
The
all right,
search was
Yeah.
his passion.
off and on.
Yes, I know. But do you believe in that fairy tale, Marcus? Do you believe the Grail actually exists? He glanced up and spoke with conviction. The search for the cup of Christ is the search for the divine in all of us. The plane soared through bright sunlight, past clouds that clung to the sky like tiny white commas. The Atlantic stretched below them, an endless stretch of blue, a desert of blue, brilliant and blinding, but Indy saw none of it. For most of the trip he was preoccupied with his father's Grail diary. He went through it, carefully reading each entry, each page, seeking clues. The word Grail is derived from graduale, which means step by step, degree by degree. He read on a page near the beginning. There are 6 degrees or levels of awareness in the Grail quest, and each one is represented by an animal. The raven was the symbol of the 1st degree and represented the messenger of the Grail and the finger of fate that initiated the quest. The peacock signified the 2nd degree and symbolized the search for immortality. It also suggested the colorful and imaginative nature of the quest. The sign for the 3rd degree was the swan, because the one who took up the Grail quest sang a swan song to selfish and indulgent ways. In order to succeed in the quest, one must overcome weaknesses of the mind and heart and move beyond petty likes and dislikes. The 4th degree was signified by a pelican, a bird willing to nurture its young by wounding its own breast. It symbolized the quality of self-sacrifice and the willingness to endanger self for the sake of saving one's own people. The lion was the sign of the 5th degree. It stood for leadership, conquest, and the attainment of high goals. The 6th and highest level, represented by the eagle, was achieved at the end of the quest. At that time, the seeker of the Grail would have gained the power and the knowledge necessary to understand fully the significance of the search. Andy snapped out of his reverie as the steward tapped him on the shoulder and asked if he'd like a drink. He nodded, and as he adjusted himself in the seat, a folded piece of paper fell from the diary into the aisle. The steward picked it up, handed it back to him along with a drink. He set the glass down on the tray in front of him and unfolded the paper. It was a rubbing that he immediately recognized as an impression of Donovan's Grail tablet. The top part of it was blank, as if space had been left for the missing section of the tablet. Look at this, Marcus. He held it out to Brody, and then realized his traveling partner was fast asleep. He refolded the paper and was about to slip it into the diary when he noticed the drawing on the page that had fallen open. It was a sketch of what appeared to be a stained glass window of a night. Below it was one word: Venice. He wondered about its significance, and it wouldn't be long before he'd find out. Venice. Andy sighed, looking around, nodding to himself, drawing a kind of sustenance from his surroundings. As he and Brody disembarked from the water bus at the boat landing, Andy's sense of euphoria abruptly evaporated. A band of fascist militiamen passed by with a civilian suspect in tow. At the side of the boat, the civilians started struggling to escape. The militiamen reacted swiftly and harshly. They struck the man with their clubs, kicked him with their heavy boots, and the man whimpered and cried out and tried to get away. He finally collapsed against the cobblestones, his face bloody. His body as still as a dead man's. Villainous, he said again. But this time his voice was heavier, thicker, reflecting the concern for what was taking place in Italy and throughout Europe. Fascists and Nazis had thrown the continent into havoc. Who the hell knew where it would all end, or when, or how, or if? As they looked around, Indy wondered aloud how they would recognize Dr. Schneider when they saw him. Donovan hadn't given them any description of his father's colleague. He just said he'd be there waiting. A woman suddenly approached them from the crowd and smiled. She was an attractive blonde with high cheekbones and a slender figure. Her lapis-colored eyes were bright and intelligent. Dr. Jones? Yes, Indy smiled. Schneider must have sent his secretary to pick them up, and he didn't mind one bit. I knew it was you. Her manner was brazenly flirtatious. You have your father's eyes. Indy was instantly attracted to her. And my mother's ears, but all the rest belongs to you. He expected her to be flustered. Instead, she laughed. It was a light, beautiful sound, full of life, and for a second he thought she was laughing at him. What the hell, he thought. So it wasn't the most original line. Who cared? He would have said it again just to hear her laugh once more. Looks like the best parts have already been spoken for, she said. Indy grinned, enjoying the repartee. The woman turned to Brody. Marcus Brody? That's right. My name is Elsa Schneider. They entered the vast Piazza San Marco, and she directed the conversation immediately to the matter at hand. The last time I saw your father, we were in the Marciana library. That's where I'm taking you now. I left Dr. Jones working in the library. When I got back to his table, he was gone, and so were all his papers, except for one thing. She held up a scrap of paper and looked from Brody to Indy. I found this near his chair. Indy took the paper from her, unfolded it. The only thing that was written on it were the Roman numerals 3, 7, and 10. Indy contemplated that bit of information. Elsa pointed her gloved hand to her right. Here's the library. I've been trying to figure out those numbers all week, Elsa whispered. 3, 7, and 10. They don't appear to be a biblical reference. I've checked every combination of chapter and verse in the Gospels. They walked between two massive granite pillars and entered a room with tall rows of bookshelves. Elsa led them to the corner of the room and stopped by a table where she ran her hand lovingly over a couple of precious leather-bound books. Your eyes are shining, Indy commented. A great library always makes me cry, even a single book. It's almost sacred, like a brick in the temple of all our history. In this case, it's almost the literal truth. We're on holy ground. This used to be the chapel of a Franciscan monastery. Elsa pointed towards several marble pillars. Those columns were brought back as spoils of war after the sacking of Byzantium during the Crusades. The moment Elsa was out of sight, Indy grabbed Brody by the arm and pointed at the stained glass window. Marcus, I've seen this window before. Brody frowned. Where? Indy took out the Grail diary and opened it to the sketch he had noticed during the plane flight. He tapped the diary. Right here. Brody studied the sketch, looked up at the window, then down at the sketch again, and nodded slowly. Good God, Indy, it's the same. Do you see it? Yes, the Roman numerals are part of the window's design. Dad was onto something here. Brody handed the diary back to Indy. Yes, but what? We know where the numbers came from, but we still don't know what they mean. Andy saw Elsa approaching and quickly tucked the diary back into his pocket. Dad sent me this diary for a reason, so until we find out why, I think we should keep it to ourselves. Brody pointed to the window. 3, 7, and 10. There it is, the source of the Roman numerals. My God, you're right. Dad wasn't looking for a book, but the knight's tomb. He was looking for the tomb itself. Elsa's expression was utterly blank. She finally shook her head. What do you mean? Don't you get it, Elsa? The tomb is somewhere in the library. You said yourself that this place used to be a church. Andy's eyes rested on one of the marble columns there. He jabbed his finger at it and strode across the room as Elsa and Brody hurried after him. 3. Andy pointed to the Roman numerals embedded in the column and smiled triumphantly. I'll bet they're all numbered. They're spread out. Let's find the others, 7 and 10. They headed off in separate directions, each one making a beeline toward a column. A moment later, Brody motioned to Indy. He'd found 7. They kept looking, but none of them could find the last one, 10. They regrouped in the center of the room, about halfway between the 3 and 7 columns. Damn, it has to be here, Indy muttered. It's got to be. I'm sure of it. He walked over to a ladder leading to a loft, climbed up it, looked down, hoping that his new perspective would offer a clue. It took only a moment to see it. It was that obvious. The floor where Brody and Elsa stood was an elaborate tile design that contained a huge X, and that was visible only if you were above it. X marks the spot, he said aloud and grinned. He rushed down the ladder, found the center tile where the X intersected. He bent down on one knee and started prying the tile with his knife. What are you doing? Elsa whispered, and looked about anxiously to see who might be watching the crazy foreigner who was ripping up the floor. I'm going to find the knight's tomb. The words hissed through his gritted teeth as he struggled with the tile. What do you think? After several moments, the tile popped free, revealing a 2-foot square hole and proving him right. Cold air and a wet, rancid smell escaped from the dark cavity. Indy looked up at Elsa and Brody and smiled broadly. Bingo! You don't disappoint, Dr. Jones, Elsa said, brushing a strand of blonde hair back in place. You're a great deal like your father, except he's lost and I'm not. And he peered down into the blackness of the hole, then took a coin from his pocket and dropped it. He heard a soft plop. A second later, the bottom was about 6 feet down. Back so soon? He was about to climb into the hole when Elsa touched him on the shoulder. Ladies first, Indiana Jones. Please lower me down. Andy tipped his fedora, impressed by the woman's spirit. Andy glanced over his shoulder at Brody. Keep an eye on things, Marcus. Brody nodded. I'll put the tile back in place so they don't attract any attention. Good idea. He reached in his pocket for the Grail diary and removed the folded piece of paper. He stuffed it in his shirt and then passed the diary to Brody. Take care of this for me. Will do. Indy glanced down the hole, then back to Brody. Be back soon. I hope. He dropped down into the hole, and the tiles slid back in place. Instantly, the darkness collapsed around him. I think we found the catacombs, Elsa said from behind him. Look at this, she said. Pagan symbols, 4th or 5th century. The Christians would have dug their own passages and burial chambers centuries later, Elsa added. He knew she was right and told her so. If a knight from the First Crusade is entombed down here, that's where we'll find him. They continued deeper into the catacombs. The passageway narrowed. The water rose to their knees. Yet he stopped. He heard a thrashing in the water and a squealing sound. He held up the lighter. Rats. 2, 3, 4 of them. And it's no big deal, as long as he had discounted them. He saw a couple more, and then others. Then there were dozens of them, diving from ledges into the water. He cautiously stepped ahead and saw the water churning with rats. He recalculated. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of them, pouring into the passageway. The outcropping of rock was just wide enough for them to gain footing. It was wet, slippery, and they inched forward holding hands, their backs flat against the wall. Below them the river of squealing rats rushed by, and occasionally Indy booted a few from the ledge. They were soon slogging through ankle-deep water that was dark and slimy. Indy noticed the water percolating in spots. He dipped his fingers into it and rubbed them together. Petroleum. I could sink a well down here and retire. The passageway turned and opened into an expansive chamber that was flooded with black, briny water, but appeared devoid of rats. They paused a moment, gazing in silence toward the center of the cavern. Jutting up above the water on a stone platform were several ancient caskets. An island altar, Indy thought. It must be one of these, Indy said. This one, Elsa said. Indy nodded. He wasn't sure she was right, but she seemed confident about her choice. Indy leaned over and strained to open the lid. Elsa joined him. The top groaned as it slowly rose, and then suddenly it slid away from the coffin and banged against the stone platform. He peered down and saw a rusted suit of armor and an intricately carved shield. The hood of the helmet was turned up, and inside it, the hollow eyes of a skull stared up at him. This is the night, Elsa proclaimed. Look at the engraving on the shield. It's the same as Donovan's Grail tablet. Indy was elated. The shield is the second marker. We found it. Indy reached into his shirt, took out the paper impression of the Grail tablet. He unfolded it and laid it over the shield. The portion missing from the tablet was there on the shield. A perfect match. We've got it. He looked around, tilted his head, listening, and there was something wrong. He heard a distant squealing, and it was getting louder and closer. Those rats again. Then he saw the glow of firelight dancing across the walls of the catacombs. A moment later he saw the rats. Thousands of them squirmed through the narrow passage, stampeded into the chamber, and headed toward the stone platform. Within seconds, the rats washed over the platform and caskets, a squirming, squealing tidal wave, and then Indy saw what they were scurrying to escape. An enormous fireball roared around the corner. It was feeding on the oil slick and depleting the oxygen, an elemental monster devouring everything in its path. It was spreading across the chamber and heading toward them. Elsa screamed. Indy stuffed the rubbing from the shield inside his shirt and then braced his back against the altar and toppled the coffin with his feet. It crashed against the stone platform and splashed into the water. It sank and then bobbed to the surface. Jump! Indy shouted. For a second, Elsa didn't move. Indy grabbed her hand and yanked her along after him. They struck the water, inches from the bobbing, overturned coffin. Fingers of flame licked across the surface, sizzling masses of shrieking rats. Indy grabbed onto the coffin. Get under it, quick! Air pockets! The coffin's on fire, Elsa yelled above the shriek of the rats. There go the rats, Indy said as nonchalantly as possible, but he knew their situation was desperate. Can you swim? Austrian swim team, 1932 Summer Olympics, silver medal in the 50-meter freestyle. A simple yes or no would have sufficed. Take a deep breath. We'll have to swim under the fire. They filled their lungs and dove under. As he swam, Indy wondered why the fire had started. Maybe a spark from the lighter had ignited it, but they would have noticed it much sooner. 30 seconds. What if someone had followed them? If so, then what happened to Brody? 45 seconds. He saw a faint light to his left and headed toward it. 1 minute. The light was filtering through a storm drain that opened into the wall. Indy paused and looked back to Elsa. The source of light must lead outside. But would they fit through the opening? He swam into the drain and had gone less than 50 feet when he reached a hole in the top of it. A spindle of light pierced down through it, and the opening was just large enough for his shoulders. And he wasn't about to argue. He'd been underwater at least a minute and a half, maybe longer, and his lungs were ready to burst. He kicked hard, shot up, and his head broke the surface. He gulped at the air. Nothing had ever tasted so sweet. A moment later, Elsa surfaced next to him. To his surprise, she didn't even seem out of breath. He looked up. A shaft rose 20 feet up to the daylight, and when he reached the top, he pushed up on one side of the grating. Indy glanced around. They were in the corner of Piazza San Marco, a few feet from a sidewalk cafe where the people were gawking and talking excitedly among themselves. Indy smiled broadly as he gazed at the postcard-perfect scene. Ah, Venice. His good humor, however, was short-lived. Indy turned from the gawking patrons of the cafe to the man who had helped him from the sewer. He was about to thank him when he realized something was wrong. Unlike everyone else nearby, the man's attention was turned away from them. He was staring across the plaza toward the library. Indy followed his gaze and saw 4 men running in their direction. He noticed the one in front wore a fez. Then he saw something else. One of them was sporting a machine gun. Indy leaped into a motorboat. He fired the engine. It sputtered and died. "Hurry, Indy, they're almost..." He pulled again, and the engine fired. He shoved it into gear, and at that moment the boat rocked violently, and Elsa shouted. Indy pulled down on the throttle and glanced back just in time to block a punch. One of the men had boarded just as he pulled away. The boat veered wildly as the 2 men exchanged punches. Elsa crawled past them, grabbed the wheel, and turned sharply, barely missing several gondolas. Gondoliers stopped singing and shook their fists as they careened along the canal. One of the gondolas flipped over in the sudden backwash of the speedboat. "I guess that takes care of that," he yelled toward Elsa. "Think again." Behind them, a pair of speedboats were giving chase and gaining rapidly on them. He crawled toward the wheel. "Let me handle this." "Wait until I..." He looked up and his jaw dropped. They were moving toward an enormous steamship straight ahead. The hull of the ship was drifting toward the dock, and the gap ahead of them was narrowing. "Are you crazy?" he shouted. "Don't go between them. We'll never..." At this point, it no longer mattered. The hull of the ship and the side of the dock loomed on either side of them like cavern walls. Indy crouched down, grabbed the side of the boat, and squeezed his eyes closed, waiting for the impact. He heard a piercing screech of metal, but they were still in one piece. He opened his eyes and looked back. Just behind them, one of the other boats had smashed into the hull. Indy breathed a sigh of relief. But a moment later, he saw the other boat emerge from the far side of the steamboat. "Let me handle this," he said, taking over the steering. "You scare me." Suddenly, a machine gun chattered, and splinters flew away from the side of the boat. Indy grabbed his pistol and fired at the other boat until he was out of bullets. Elsa was pointing to the side of the boat. They were drifting and heading right toward the rotating blades of an enormous propeller on the stern of another steamship. The other boat drew close to them. One of the men held a machine gun on them. The other, who was behind the wheel, stood up and smiled at Indy. He was swarthy, in his late 30s. His dark, compelling eyes seemed to bore right through Indy. The boat bumped against them, pushing them closer to the churning propeller. Indy was almost too exhausted to think. He had unraveled the ancient code, battled rats and slimy water, found the Grail night, and narrowly escaped a fire. Then the flight and battle on the water had followed in rapid succession. Now, as he stared eye to eye to the man, he just wanted to know what the hell was going on. Then he remembered Brody. "What did you do to my friend back in the library?" The man laughed. His eyes were now dark pools that revealed nothing. "Your friend will be okay. You'd better worry about yourself." And he glanced over his shoulder and saw that they had drifted closer to the propellers. "Who are you? And what do you want, anyhow?" "My name is Kazim, and I'm after the same thing you are, my friend." "Your kind of friends I don't need. I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do, Dr. Jones." The boat rocked in the turbulent water near the propeller. Indy turned to Elsa, signaled her with his eyes that it was time to act. "Enough talk!" Kazim yelled over the noise of the propellers as it slapped against the water. "Better luck in the next world!" He motioned for the man with the machine gun to shoot him. Elsa jumped to the other boat, momentarily distracting the man with the gun. Indy leaped the gap, and his forearm came up under the machine gun, which fired harmlessly in the air. As they battled for control of the gun, the engine started. The boat sped forward, and Indy lost his balance. He fell over the side, pulling the man with the machine gun with him. He let go of the man and swam as fast as he could, away from the pull of the propeller. The gunman, desperate and panicking, yelled for help. Behind him, Indy heard a loud crunch as the other boat was dragged underwater. With a deafening crash, the propeller blades of the steamship violently tore it apart like a piece of balsa wood, scattering shredded bits of the boat across the surface of the water. Kazim swung the boat about and edged as close as he could to the steamship. Indy swam for it as Elsa leaned over the side, stretching her hand until he grasped it. End of side 1.
Just so you know, I don't know many
That's what I'm telling you. We're working on it.
for entertainment purposes.
No, I just want to make sure. That's what, because they said we are at schedule.
The gunman wasn't so lucky. He was already floundering in the bubbling maelstrom a few feet from the slicing blades. He screamed again to Kazim, but it was too late, and he looked back just as the man was sucked into the blades. Kazim shoved the motor into gear, and the boat tore away from the pull of the steamship. He zigzagged, trying to shake Indy from the side, but Elsa clutched his arm, dragging him until he grabbed the side of the boat. And then, with a final burst of energy, he pulled himself out of the water and flopped onto the floor of the boat, gasping for breath. He looked up and saw Kazim trying to load his gun and steer the boat at the same time. He crawled forward and shoved him against the wheel, causing the boat to spin 180 degrees back to the direction of the steamboat. "Indy, we're going back toward..." Before Elsa could finish, he switched off the engine, pulled out the key. He pressed his thumb against the man's throat. "Okay, Kazim, you and I are going to have a little chat." Kazim stammered as Indy let up on his throat. "You foolish man." He tried to sound calm and dignified. "What are you doing, Dr. Jones? Are you crazy?" "Where's my father?" "Let go of me, please." "Where is my father?" "If you don't let go, Dr. Jones, we'll both die. We're drifting back toward the steamship." Indy heard the chop of the blades cutting through the water. He didn't even bother to look back. His eyes were wide and his voice sounded hysterical. "Good! Then we'll die!" Indy grabbed the front of Kazim's shirt. "This is your last chance, damn it!" Kazim's shirt ripped open, revealing a tattoo on his chest in the shape of a Christian cross that tapered down like the blades of a broadsword. He stared placidly back at Indy, undisturbed. "What's that supposed to be?" Indy asked. Kazim raised his head high. "It's an ancient family symbol. My forebears were princes of an empire that stretched from Morocco to the Caspian Sea." "Allah be praised," Indy said quietly. "Thank you, and God save you too. But I was referring to the Christian empire of Byzantium. The secret of the Grail has been safe for 1,000 years, and for all that time, the Brotherhood of the Cruciform Sword has been prepared to do anything to keep it safe." Indy's eyes narrowed as he looked again at the tattoo on Kazim's chest. Then he met the man's gaze, held it for a long moment. The roar of the blades was as loud now as it had been when he was treading water. The boat rocked violently beneath him. "Ask yourself why you seek the cup of Christ, for his glory or yours," Kazim said. "I didn't come for the cup of Christ. I came to find my father." Kazim nodded, glanced over Indy's shoulder toward the steamship. "In that case, God be with you in your quest. Your father is being held in the Brunwald Castle on the Austrian-German border." Indy suddenly pushed Kazim aside, jammed the key into ignition. He felt the spray from the steamship's giant propeller on his back, and he turned the key. The engine sputtered and died. Come on, start. He tried again. This time the engine revved to life, and they pulled away just seconds before the blades would have chewed into the hull. In spite of the ice pack, Brody sounded as excited as Indy had ever seen him. He hurried into the library, dropped a piece of paper on the massive mahogany table that dominated the room. The paper was what remained of the rubbing from the knight's shield. Indy nodded. Brody pointed at the ancient lettering, and Indy leaned close, but Brody could not contain himself. You see, it's Alexandretta. Indy walked to a shelf and searched until he found an atlas. Indy knew that the knights of the First Crusade had laid siege to Alexandretta for more than a year, and the entire city had been destroyed. Today, the city of Iskenderun on Hété's Mediterranean coast was built on its ruins. He found the page he wanted and stabbed at it. Here, look, Marcus. This is the desert. This is the mountain range. Just the way the Grail tablet described it. Somewhere in these mountains must be the canyon of the crescent moon. He paused, studied it, but where? Where in these mountains? Your father would know, Brody said quietly. He would? Let me take a look at the diary. Indy passed it to him. Your father did know. He knew everything except the city from which to start. He drew a map with no names. Here it is. He set the diary on the table and opened it to a pencil-drawn map that covered 2 pages. Indy had looked at it briefly on the airplane, but since there were no names, it hadn't meant anything to him. And now they knew, for all the good it would do his father. I'm sure there's enough detail here to find it, Indy. I'm going after it. Brody looked at him, his spirits soaring after his discovery. I hope you'll come with me. Andy shook his head and closed the Grail diary. I'm going after Dad. I'm leaving first thing in the morning for Austria. I won't stop you, but before you leave, contact Sala. Have him meet you in Iskenderun. Brody nodded in agreement. Sala was an old friend of both men. When Andy had pursued the Ark of the Covenant in Egypt, Sala had saved his life more than once. He would feel a lot better about Brody chasing after the Grail Cup if he knew that Sala was with him. As they neared the apartment, Andy felt increasingly anxious. It was as if dozens of tiny needles were poking the back of his neck. As soon as they reached the apartment, he knew the intuitive sensation had proved itself again. The door was slightly ajar. Andy rushed to his bedroom, swung open the door. The room had been ransacked, the mattress on the floor. The drawers had been dumped. Oh, God, what happened to Elsa? He hurried down the hall to Elsa's room. He paused, took a breath, and slowly turned the doorknob. Someone had rifled through her room as well. He backed out of the room and heard a distant, muffled voice. He crept down the hallway. The voice grew louder and more distinct. It was a woman's voice, singing, coming from the bathroom. He opened the door a crack. Elsa. Hello, Andy. She was in a bathtub full of bubbles, smiling brightly at him. I'll be right out. He waited as he heard Elsa singing in the hallway en route to her room. He looked at his watch, estimating how long it would take her to change her tune. She shrieked, and he smiled. He waited for her to run to his room. He heard footsteps. She swung open his door. She was dressed in a bathrobe. Her hair was still wet. Her jaw looked as though it had come unhinged. Andy, my room. Yeah, mine too. She shook her head. What are they looking for, anyway? This. He took the Grail diary out of his pocket and tossed it onto the table. Your father's Grail diary. You had it. Uh-huh. You didn't tell me. She shook her head. You don't trust me. I didn't know you. He looked into her soft blue eyes. His thumb ached to trace the pout of her mouth. Christ, but she was hard to resist. Or maybe I wanted to know you better. The Mercedes-Benz Andy had rented glided smoothly around the sharp mountain curves of the Austrian Alps. When they started out, the sky had been crisp, clear, smooth, even blue. But by late afternoon, as he and Elsa neared the German border, and the grounds of the Brunwald Castle, storm clouds climbed the horizon, and thunder rumbled in the distance. A perfect day for a friendly visit, Indy thought, casting an eye toward Elsa. He reached into the back seat for his bullwhip, focusing his thoughts on the matter in hand. He attached it to his belt as he got out of the car. "What are you going to do?" she asked as they headed toward the castle. "I don't know. I'll think of something." They watched a pair of uniformed Nazi soldiers walk by. One of them laughed loudly at something the other had said, and his voice echoed down the hallway. "Yes, I should have known," and he whispered to Elsa as the men disappeared. A door stood ajar nearby, and he heard voices from the inside room. He peeked through the crack. Nazis were busy examining works of art. Looted booty, he thought. Hitler was interested in amassing as many of Europe's works of art and primitive artifacts as he could, but not solely for the value of the ancient treasures. And he was well aware that Hitler had a special interest in obtaining ancient mystical objects that he believed would enhance his power and thus expand his empire. And no doubt the leader of the Third Reich would also like to get his hands on the Grail Cup that had once held the blood of Jesus. And that, he knew, was why his father was being held captive here. He backed away from the crack. He and Elsa moved silently down the corridor. At the end of it were 3 doors. Indy looked from one to the next and then jabbed his forefinger at the door on the left. This one. He swung his leg over the window frame, looked back through the window at Elsa. "Stay there. I won't be long." His timing had to be perfect. He watched for a bolt of lightning and noted that the rain was not quite so hard. When he saw the flash, he counted the seconds until he heard the clap of thunder. He waited until the next bolt lit the sky. He grasped his bullwhip with both hands, counted to himself, then pushed off from the castle wall. He added an extra number in his calculation, figuring the storm was starting to recede. He curled in his legs as he swung back and crashed through the door with both feet. The impact was timed precisely with the thunder. He tumbled into the room, falling on his hands and knees. Rain and cold air whipped into the room through the broken shutters. He rose to his feet, looked around to get his bearings. Just as he realized his father was nowhere in sight, something heavy crashed down on the back of his head and shattered. And he stumbled, sank to one knee. Stunned, his vision blurred, he looked up helplessly as someone stepped out from the shadows. "Junior." "Yes, sir," he said, responding with a reflex reaction left over from his childhood. He rubbed his head, focusing on his father. "It's you, Junior." And his head cleared. Now he was annoyed. "Stop calling me that. What the devil are you doing here?" He wondered if the Nazis had done something to his father's mind. "What do you think? I've come to get you out of here." Henry looked down at his hand, suddenly distracted and alarmed by what he saw. "Wait a minute." And he sucked in his breath, tensed, glanced around. "What's wrong?" "Late 14th century Ming dynasty," he muttered to himself. Indy frowned as he realized the fuss was about the broken vase his father was holding. "It breaks the heart," Henry exclaimed. "Also the head," Andy interrupted. "You hit me with it, Dad." Still looking at the vase, Henry continued, "I'll never forgive myself." Andy misunderstood his father, who was still talking about the vase. "Forget it. I'm fine. Thank God." Henry looked relieved as he examined the broken end of the vase. "It's fake." "You see, take a look. You can tell by the cross-sections," Andy and Henry said simultaneously. They looked at each other and both of them grinned. "Sorry about your head," Henry said, frowning a little as if noticing his son for the first time. "I thought you were one of them." "I found the entrance to the Catacomb." Henry was suddenly excited. "Through the library. You found it." "That's right," Andy smiled, pleased to see his father impressed with something he'd done. "I knew it." He stabbed at the air with his fist. "I just knew it." "And the tomb of Sir Richard." "Found it." Henry was breathless. He was actually there. You saw him? What was left of him? Henry's voice fell on an excited whisper and trembled with expectation. And the shield, the inscription on Sir Richard's shield. Indy nodded again, paused a beat, then answered in one word, Alexandretha. Henry continued, You did it! No, you did it, Dad. 40 years of scholarship and research. The resounding thud silenced him. His head snapped toward the door just as 3 Nazis marched into the room. 2 of them held machine guns aimed at them. The third was an SS officer. Yes, Indy and Henry answered at the same time. I'll take that book now. What book? They both said simultaneously. The officer turned to Indy and said, You have the diary in your pocket. Henry's laugh was straight from the belly, and Indy thought, Oh, God, I'm going to be sick. You don't. Do you really think my son would be stupid enough to bring the diary all the way back to the very place from where... Henry stopped and slowly turned to Indy. You didn't, did you, Junior? Can we discuss this later, Dad? I don't think this right now is the... I should have mailed it to the Marx Brothers, he fumed. I came here to save you, Indy said lamely, then glanced at the machine guns. And who's going to save you, Junior? Henry roared, his face turning red. What happened next took place so fast that when it was over, Indy hardly believed what he'd done. His eyes blazed, his nostrils flared with anger. He looked as if he was about to punch his father, and was so convincing, Henry drew back, anticipating the blow. But instead, Indy's arm shot out and ripped one of the machine guns from a startled guard. With a quick kick, he knocked the barrel of the second machine gun in the air. Bullets sprayed the ceiling. An instant later, Indy's fingers squeezed the trigger of the machine gun. Henry stared in disbelief as the 3 Nazis bled and died. He was shocked and horrified. Look what you did. You killed them. And he grabbed him by the arm and pulled him out of the room. He placed his hand on the knob of the adjoining door where Elsa was waiting and turned it. I can't believe what you did, Henry whispered hoarsely, his eyes wide with astonishment. You killed those men. And he paused in the doorway. What the hell do you think they were going to do to us? His father frowned as if trying to justify his son's violence in his mind. And he swung the door open, raised his hand to signal Elsa that it was time to flee. His hand froze. He was staring into the face of a Nazi. One of the man's muscular arms was coiled around Elsa's waist like a thick snake. His other hand held a Luger, its muzzle pressed behind her ear. That is far enough, Dr. Jones. A big man, a colonel, lantern jaw, small dark eyes, and insect's eyes. He redefined the word brute, no doubt about it. Put down the gun, right now, the colonel ordered, his thick accent not awkward. Unless you want to see your lady friend die. Don't listen to him, Henry said. Drop it now, the colonel demanded. No, Henry shouted. She's with them. Indy, please, Elsa pleaded, her eyes wide with fear. She's a Nazi, Henry countered. What? Indy shook his head, confused. He didn't know what to do. He looked at Elsa, then back to his father. Everyone was yelling at once. Trust me, Henry shouted. Indy, no, Elsa begged. I have killed the Fräulein. The colonel spat through his clenched teeth. Go ahead, Henry told him. Don't shoot her, Indy yelled. He won't, Henry answered. Indy, please, Elsa implored. Please do what he says. For God's sake, don't listen to her, Henry roared at his son. Enough! She dies! The colonel jammed the barrel of his Luger into Elsa's neck. She screamed in pain. Wait! Indy dropped the machine gun on the floor and kicked it away. Henry groaned. The colonel released his grip on Elsa and shoved her toward Indy. He caught her in his arms and he held her tightly as she buried her face in his chest. I'm sorry, Indy. He comforted her. It's okay. I'm so sorry. Her hand slipped into his coat pocket and removed the Grail diary. She smiled sadly at him. But you should have listened to your father. He never did, Henry uttered in an exasperated tone. He never did. Didn't I tell you not to trust anyone, Dr. Jones? Donovan smiled benignly as he flipped casually through the Grail diary. And he had no snappy response. He didn't say anything at all. This was the man who had told him his father was missing, the man who had told him to meet Dr. Schneider in Venice, the bastard behind the whole scheme. What could he possibly say that would make any difference? Henry gave an indignant snort, but when he spoke his voice was old and tired. I misjudged you, Walter. I knew you'd sell your mother for an Etruscan vase. I didn't know you'd sell your country and your soul to this bunch of madmen. Donovan ignored Henry. The crease in his forehead deepened as he paged through the diary, faster and faster. Obviously something was wrong. Dr. Schneider, he stammered. Elsa rushed over to him. What is it? Donovan held up the Grail diary and shook it in her face. This book contained a map with no names, but with precise directions from the unknown city to the secret canyon of the Holy Grail. Yes, she said, it's known as the Canyon of the Crescent Moon. Where is the map? Elsa shrugged, looked a little uneasy. She said she didn't know. She saw it was in the diary. Donovan, his face pink with anger, looked from Elsa to Indy. Well, where are the missing pages? We must have them. Henry glanced at Indy, looked surprised and quite pleased. Indy smirked. You're wasting your breath asking him, Elsa said. He won't tell us. He doesn't have to. She smiled a triumphant smile at Indy and turned to Donovan. He gave them to Marcus Brody. Henry squeezed his eyes closed as if to shut out what he just heard. When he opened them again, he turned them on Indy. Marcus? You dragged poor Marcus along? My God, Junior, he's not up to the challenge. We'll find him, Donovan said, and turned away, dismissing them. Don't be so sure, Indy called after him. He's got a 2-day start on you, which is more than he needs. Indy and Henry were tied back to back in a pair of chairs, watched over by 2 hulking Nazi guards. So Vogel stepped between Donovan and the captives. Allow me to kill them. Then we will have no more accidents like upstairs. No, Elsa said. If we fail to recover the pages from Brody, we will need them alive. Donovan hesitated, uncertain. He regarded Indy and his father as though they were interesting and possibly valuable artifacts. To Vogel, he said, always do what the doctor orders. We'll wait. Then they are yours. Come along, Donovan said, and walked over to the fireplace. He stepped into it, opened a hidden door. Vogel and his guards followed him. Donovan disappeared through the fireplace. Elsa watched the fireplace until she was sure they were gone. Then she turned to Indy, her expression a perfect duplicate of their most intimate moments together in Venice. Her skin smelled faintly of soap and perfume, and stirred memories he preferred not to think about. Indy wanted to spit in her face, but instead he nodded, played along with her in a hope that she would loosen the knots and give them a chance to get away. She leaned forward, kissed him passionately, stroking his head with her hand. Dr. Schneider! Elsa abruptly stood up and turned toward the fireplace. Vogel had returned through the hidden entrance. Ja, Herr Colonel. She turned her head but kept her back to the Nazi. Your car is waiting. Thank you. She smiled at Indy, brushed strands of her hair from her cheek. That's the way Austrians say goodbye. Elsa walked over to Vogel. I'm ready now. She slipped through the door behind the fireplace. Indy blinked his eyes, clearing his head. We've got to get Marcus before the Nazis do. I thought you said Marcus had a 2-day start and that he would blend in, disappear. Are you kidding? I made that up. You know Marcus. He got lost once in his own museum. Henry swore under his breath. That's just great. Bad enough that that monster Vogel is itching to kill us. But now we're going to get Marcus killed and lose the Grail Cup to the Nazis. Now his father started pulling from his side. But the harder they pulled, the tighter the knots got, and the deeper the rope sliced into their wrists. Indy's head jerked up. He suddenly knew how to get the ropes undone. Dad, can you reach into my coat pocket? It took a couple of minutes before Henry could touch the top of the pocket. Finally, after more shifting around, his fingers slid inside of... What am I looking for? My good luck charm. Feels like a cigarette lighter to me. Come on, work. Henry shook the lighter, tried it again. There we go. I got it. Instantly, Indy felt the flame on his fingers. Dad, burn the rope, not my hand. For the next few minutes, Henry held the lighter against the rope. As the rope finally began to smolder and burn, Indy heard Henry curse. What happened? Indy asked. I dropped it. Indy smelled something. Hey, what the hell's burning? That's what I was going to say. The floor is on fire. What? Indy cranked his head as far as he could and saw the tongues of fire. All right, let's move. Rock your chair. Do what I do. They inched their way slowly across the room and away from the burning carpet. Indy rubbed his hands up and down, trying to get them free of the rope, and suddenly his bonds broke. He slid off the chair and quickly unraveled the ropes around his father's wrists. He turned away and searched for a way out. There had to be another exit, another secret door, a window, something. He ran his hands over the walls, knocked his knuckles against them, listening for a hollowness. You won't find the way out that way, Henry told him. Let's sit down and work this out. Sit down? Indy's eyes widened. Are you crazy? Stop panicking. I often find if I sit down calmly, the solution soon presents itself. Henry slumped down into an overstuffed sofa. As he did, it budged slightly and started to tilt forward as a section of the floor opened. Indy leaped onto the sofa, realizing that his father had found an exit. I see what you mean, he yelled as they slid down a ramp several hundred feet until they were deposited on a dock. They were inside an enormous cavern that covered an underground causeway. The cavern obviously had been transformed into a Nazi storage depot. Indy and Henry appropriated a motorcycle and sidecar. Indy was at the bike's wheel, and his father squashed into the little connecting car. Well, would you say this has been just another typical day for you? Henry shouted as they roared along the dock. Better than most, Indy yelled, accelerating toward a circle of light he hoped was the way out of the mountain. If it wasn't an exit, he wasn't sure what the next move would be. Maybe there wouldn't even be a next move. Indy ducked low on the motorcycle, and a moment later they burst into the bright morning sunlight. As the motorcycle raced toward a crossway, the sign indicated Budapest to the right and Berlin to the left. Indy slowed at the intersection and turned right. Hold it! Henry yelled. Stop! Turn around! We've got to go to Berlin! Indy pointed to the other direction. But Brody is that way, Dad! My diary is this way, Henry answered, jerking his thumb in the opposite direction. We don't need your diary. Oh, yes, you do. You didn't tear out enough pages, Junior. He glared defiantly at Indy. When they arrived in Berlin, a rally was taking place, and they had found a uniformed Nazi who was separated from his unit. Indy knocked the Nazi cold and stripped off his uniform. The rally was breaking up, and Indy pressed his way past a throng of torch-bearing Nazis. Among them, on a raised dais, were two familiar faces, Adolf Hitler and Dr. Elsa Schneider. Oh my God, Henry moaned and shook his head. On the right hand of the fiend himself. Do you believe she's a Nazi now? Indy said nothing. Indy pressed his way past the throng of torch-bearing Nazis. He perused the dispersing crowd and spotted Elsa walking alone. Fraulein Doctor? Indy, she gasped. His voice was quiet and tough, his eyes hard and unforgiving. Where is it? You followed me. She said it in a way that made him wonder if she was still attracted to him. He brushed her hand aside and slipped his hands over her body, searching her pockets for the Grail diary. I want it. Where is it? Everything is right where it was the last time you looked. Indy continued with his search, ignoring her. He slid his hand along her legs and stopped as he felt something. He glanced around and then quickly reached up her dress and pulled out the Grail diary, which she had strapped to her leg. "Sorry about the inconvenience." Indy released her and backed away. "Indy," she called out. He took another step backward and then spun around and left. He found his father waiting near the platform. "Come on, we're getting out of Germany." Indy pulled up to the main terminal of the Berlin airport and parked the motorcycle. They got in line at one of the boarding gates and waited to buy their tickets. "Any luck, we'll be out of this country in an hour, and we'll find Marcus tomorrow," Indy said confidently. They purchased their tickets, asking for the next flight. Indy asked his father if he knew where the flight was headed. Henry rolled his eyes as if it was a foolish question, but to Indy's surprise said, "As a matter of fact, no. Do you?" It really didn't matter where they were going at this point, as long as it was out of Germany. But he consulted his ticket. Athens. Not exactly within walking distance of Iskenderun, but at least it's in the right direction. The same day Indy and Henry were fleeing Germany, Marcus Brody arrived by train at Iskenderun. The problems he faced in his everyday life seemed minor to the frustrations he had already experienced on this trip. And who knew what was ahead for him and Sala? That is, if he even found Sala. "Mr. Brody? Marcus Brody?" He looked up, amazed to see Sala making his way through the crowd toward him. "Marcus, where have you been?" Sala held Brody at arm's length and looked him over. "I've been waiting for you here. I've been worried." Sala was a bear of a man with black hair and eyes, and distinctive Mediterranean features. He was known for his fierce dedication to his friends, and as a formidable enemy to anyone who opposed them. "I was turned around for a while. Is Eddie here?" Sala shook his head. "No, I thought he would be with you." Now Brody didn't feel so bad. He had still managed to beat Indy here. "He's been delayed." "Ah, yes, delayed," Sala laughed. "Perfect British understatement, that." The train arrived in Iskenderun at dawn. Indy glanced around. He hoped to see Marcus waiting for them, but knew that was unlikely. Even if he was in Iskenderun, he would have no idea they were arriving at this hour. Henry apparently was thinking along the same lines. "I wonder where we'll find Marcus." No sign. "Look." Indy pointed at the heavy-set, bearded figure bounding through the crowd toward them. "Indy!" Sala bellowed. "How I have missed you!" He embraced him, lifting him off the ground. He put Indy back on the ground and turned to Henry. "Father of Indy?" "Why, yes." "Well done, sir. Your boy has blessed my life." He threw his arms around Henry, who looked as if he didn't quite know what to make of Sala, or any of the rest of it. When asked about the progress, Sala said everything that they had discussed when Brody had called him from Cairo was ready, and he was anxious for the journey to begin. Indy, like the rest of his companions, was wearing a hat draped in white cloth, and was trying to get used to the relentless heat. They rested only a short time, attending to their discomforts, and then finally setting off across the deserts. Without the map, they would never be able to locate the place where the Grail Cup was hidden, Indy thought. A distant explosion resounded through the pass, snapping Indy to attention. "What was that?" Brody asked. "The secret canyon," Henry exclaimed. "They found it." Indy recalled the words from the Grail tablet. "Across the desert and through the mountain to the canyon of the crescent moon, broad enough only for one man, to the temple of the sun, holy enough for all men." When they arrived at the site of the explosion, rocks were strewn about, and a gaping hole in the cliff led into a narrow canyon. Its walls were high and steep, the color of ochre. Indy passed his canteen around. They were all weary, hot, and sore, but they knew that they couldn't waste any time. Henry, who had taken off his jacket, led the way into the canyon. His shirt was open at the collar, and his hat was pulled low over his eyes. He didn't look like a medieval scholar now, Indy mused. If anything, his father looked like an aging adventurer who was secretly having the time of his life as he valiantly sought to fulfill his greatest desire. "Marcus," Henry said, "we're like the four heroes of the Grail legend. You're Percival, the wholly innocent. Sala is Bors, the ordinary man. My son is Galahad, the valiant knight, and his father, the old crusader Lancelot, who was turned away because he was unworthy, as perhaps I am." Then he turned to Indy, "But remember, it was Galahad who succeeded, where his father failed." They stopped and stared. The narrow canyon led into a broad, open area like an arena, and carved into one of the rocks on the far side was a spectacular Greco-Roman facade. Wide steps led up to a landing with massive columns, and beyond them was the entrance to a darkened chamber. The Temple of the Sun, Indy thought. The interior of the temple was ringed with exact copies of the stone sentinel, and beyond them was a ring of massive pillars. Indy relaxed and pointed at the knights. Then he heard something, a sound within the temple, and his senses instantly snapped to attention. In his fascination with the temple, he had momentarily forgotten that Donovan and Elsa were somewhere ahead of him. He motioned for the others to follow and to remain as silent as possible. They slipped from one pillar to the next until they were close enough to see what was taking place in the center of the temple. A soldier, armed with a sword, cautiously climbed a set of stone stairs toward an arched opening in the back wall of the temple. Standing at the base of the steps watching the soldier were Donovan and Elsa. Behind them were several Nazis and more soldiers. He noticed how she concentrated intensely on the soldier's progress. She probably assumed Indy was dead. He was just another man from her past, disposed of, forgotten. Despite everything she'd said, it was obvious that her love affair was with the Grail, with its history and legends. He looked up at the soldier who was nearing the top of the steps under the arch, and then saw something else, a body. A few steps away from the man was another soldier, and near the sprawled corpse was something else. Indy leaned forward, trying to make it out. Oh my God. It was the soldier's head. "Keep going," Donovan urged the soldier. "Keep going, you're almost there." Elsa shook her head. "It's not possible." The soldier stopped to step away from the body. "Keep going," Donovan yelled. The man took the next step under the arch, and it was his last. A loud whooshing sound, like a sudden gust of wind, swept through the temple, and suddenly the soldier's head was completely severed from his neck. It tumbled toward the steps, bounced down, and rolled toward Donovan and Elsa. Donovan motioned to one of the other soldiers, who ran over and picked up the head. He turned and tossed it in the direction where Indy and the others were hiding. The head rolled within several feet of them. The mouth gaped open. An expression of horror was frozen on its features. Indy looked away. "The breath of God," Henry said softly. At first, Indy wasn't sure what he meant, and then he remembered the 3 challenges from his father's Grail diary. The breath of God. What were the other 2? He couldn't think clearly now. He would need it to reach the Grail, but right now he needed to find a way to get past Donovan and his entourage. Brody tapped him on the shoulder. Indy." The lines on Brody's face were so deep they looked like shadows. Indy touched a finger to his lip, but then he saw what Brody had seen. A few feet away, a Nazi soldier held his revolver on them. "Around! Around!" gesturing frantically with his gun, indicating that they should move. Just then 3 more Nazis surrounded them, each with a rifle. They were pushed forward into full view of the others, their hands raised above their heads. The soldiers swung around, fixed their rifles on them. Indy saw Elsa spin on her heels, gaping at him. Her mouth seemed to quiver slightly. Donovan walked toward them, hiding his surprise behind a broad smile. He made it appear as if old friends had just arrived in town, guests for dinner, and he was the host. Ah, the Jones boys. Not a moment too soon. Welcome, welcome. We can use your expertise. I'm so happy you're still alive. You'll never get the Grail, Henry exploded. It's beyond your understanding and capability. Dr. Jones is going to recover the Grail for us, Donovan said. And he glanced in the direction of the decapitated bodies and laughed. You think it's funny? Here's your chance to go down in history if you're successful. What do you say, Indiana Jones? Go down in history is what, Donovan? A Nazi stooge like you? Donovan regarded him for a moment, and Indy couldn't tell if he was angry or amused. And then Donovan smiled and shook his head as though Indy were a child who had said something stupid. The Nazis, he spat. That's the limit of your vision? The Nazis want to write themselves into the Grail legend and take on the world. Dr. Schneider and I want the Grail itself, the cup that gives everlasting life. Hitler can have the world, but he can't take it with him. End of side 2.
I hope you enjoyed the first cassette. Now, another time I'll do the second cassette. Leave comment and subscribe, please.